Test, test. Hey guys, Liana here. It's Feedback Friday, and as I said, if I had a chance to go through this paper, I would read it. Now, I don't, unfortunately, have the text of the paper for you guys to read. I managed to get it via PDF somewhere, but PlayStation 4 won't read PDFs, so unfortunately, I cannot show you guys what I'm talking about. However, I wanted to go over this study because I finally have had a chance to read it. And the reason this is on Feedback Friday is it was brought to my attention by someone providing feedback, and at first I was like, I don't want to get into this issue anymore. I'm not an academic, blah, 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 blah. But then as I read it, I realized why the person called my attention to it. It's providing support. I won't say confirming, I won't say proving, because that's not how science works, but it's confirming support for some of the theories I have had about how cultivation theory works in video games. And like I said, these are still just theories. It's one study. I want to say it off the top. It's one study, and I'm going to zip by really fast because the guy's email is on this. But what it basically is, from the over-sexualized characters in fighting games to gender uneducated, the overuse of the damsel in distress trope in popular titles, gee, I wonder who that references, such as the Super Mario series, under and misrepresentation of females in video games has been well documented in several content analyses. Cultivation theory suggests that long-term exposure to media content can affect perceptions of social realities in a way that they become more similar to the representations in the media and, in turn, impact one's beliefs and attitudes. And then it goes on to basically say what I was saying is that previous studies haven't been detailed enough. This study is compelling because it's a 3-year study. Now, I quite like this paper, having read it, because the one thing I like that it does is it actually addresses its own limitations if you actually read the PDF. It's floating around online. I'm not going to say where it is because technically I'm not supposed to have it. But the thing I like, for one, is that they did their best to try to replicate the structure on a shorter time frame. I mean, the original cultivation theory stuff took place over 10 years. And this is 3, but otherwise they did their best to replicate the structure of that landmark study. Now, one of the things they do say, and this has become a controversial thing, is that they were testing in this study the assertion of conventional gender norms, not, I'm trying to find it in the article I'm scrolling through here. Here it is. They were testing what they call first order effects, the perception of gender roles in society. Oh no, that's something I didn't test. This study exclusively focused on second order effects on attitudes toward gender roles. I'll get to that in a second. However, it may be that there are first-order effects on the perception of gender roles in society, or second-order effects on attitudes that do not relate to gender roles, but, for example, body image, sexual harassment, benevolent sexism, or rape myth acceptance. Now, that's an important constraint for this study, because what I like about it is that it's saying what it is as well as what it's not, and that's important in determining whether a study holds weight. And I'll get to what that means in a second. Don't worry about first order and second order effects. You don't really need to know that. It's a good thing to know if you're curious about looking at it, but it's not super critical for this analysis. They also said even though the current study failed to find evidence to support the cultivation of sexist beliefs or attitude due to video game exposure, there might still be merit in applying a cultivation perspective to the effects of video games on sexism, especially if the focus is more on particular subgenres or individual games or series. And ideally, multiple dimensions of sexism pertaining to gender roles, body image, and sexual harassment are assessed on both first-order and second-order effect levels. Yes, that's true. That's true. We still need more science. We still need more studies. This study is not the beginning and the end of this discussion. No study can be. So what basically this study says is that playing video games in general does not lead to damaging effects regarding sexism. And that's significant because the original cultivation theory results showed that it didn't matter what TV you watched, it had an effect. TV as a whole had an effect. What this study leans towards, doesn't prove, but it suggests that video games on the whole do not have a cultivative effect when it comes to sexism. Now, what it says is that some genres or games have some cultivation effects on some players, which is similar to television. Now, people would have to study that, and that's going to be tricky. What this study did well as well is that it used both men and women, and it interestingly weighted for existing, it had to weight opinions based on gender, which is giving an inherent nod to general sexism in society, and that was very interesting to me. But how did this study work? What kind of questions did they ask? What did they test? Well, if you look at the appendix, which some people are mocking, things like overall game use, they separated between role-playing games, first-person shooter games, and other action games. And then they broke down the respondents by sex, age, and education. And then the questions they asked were, and basically how it worked was that they made a statement, and someone rated on a scale of 1 to 5 whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement, how strongly they agreed or disagreed, essentially. So the questions were, the man should be responsible for all major decisions made in a family. And, obviously that's going to be fairly low. It was extremely low. In a group of male and female members, a man should take on the leadership. That was even lower, believe it or not, but had a larger skew, which is interesting. Even if both partners work, the woman should be responsible for taking care of the household. Again, quite low. Now, this is in Germany, remember, and that is relevant. Now, it's not relevant the way people think it is, because I think Germany is actually a good test subject, but if you want to read up on German social norms, go ahead. I will just say that Germany has had indicators of eroding patriarchy, like an elected female head of state. These are critical indicators. So I think Germany is a great place to do this study because they have fewer, greater societal sexist influences. So this is great. If video games actually did cause sexism, then, Germany's a great place to test it. So on the second thing, they didn't, I'm looking at the tables again, there was no real change. They asked the same questions after a 3-year interval, and there was no change. Now, one would think, based on the stuff we get in games, the overwhelmingly male protagonists, the overwhelming women shown in support roles, the, male leadership, you would think you would see a shift in attitudes cultivated based on what people were seeing in media. Most notably in that question, in a group of male and female members, a man should take on the leadership. Taking care of the household, different, unless you're playing The Sims, we don't have people, cleaning and cooking. But the questions of decision-making and leadership are incredibly relevant when it comes to the complaints about there being too many male protagonists in games. And I think this study is very important for that reason. There are unanswered questions. Yes, there are. But That's a big one. That is, these issues of leadership and decision making aren't just going to affect some woman walking to her car in a dark alley. They're affecting women in every realm of our lives. You know, if somebody won't take direction from a woman as easily as they'll take from a man, that is a problem. So these three questions are quite relevant. I have a bit of an issue with the wording of a man should be responsible for all major decisions made in a family. All. I might have said a man should be responsible for major decisions made in a family. I think all would put people off. But the other two questions sort of buttress that wording there, because I dismissed that question. That's absurd. Of course everybody's going to say no, in part because they know they should. But in a group of male and female members, a man should take on the leadership. That I have actually met men who believe that still, because, you know, the protective instinct, and that's not it doesn't mean they're a bad person. It just, you know, means that there's still this lingering belief. And then the housework thing is something that has been studied and studied and studied and studied, and it's getting better. Household responsibilities are becoming more balanced, but women are still doing more. So that question, even if both partners work, the woman should be responsible for taking care of the household, that's important too. Because let's face it, there are a lot of female, especially when you get into the women in refrigerators syndrome issues in gaming, you do have women portrayed as nurturers, as caregivers. And so that's, you know, these are significant questions. Now, the other thing that's nice about this is these are good, easy, and neutral to test. Other things, you know, when you get into sexual assaults and everything like that, that's gonna be trickier. I tip my hat to whoever wants to take that on. But I am very interested in seeing those attitudes. But I think at the end of the day, we're going to get similar results to this study, in that, you know, as they said, let me see if I can find it, that, the other thing that was interesting about this study is it actually tested for what's called a selection effect, making sure that the sample size was indicative and there wasn't a skew, because gamers are inherently sexist, essentially, that they made sure that the selection of people for this study didn't influence the study, and I think that's important as well. They tried to get as neutral as they possibly could at ground zero, for lack of a better term. You know, and I see where people are going, it was in Germany. They actually say the current study was conducted within Germany, as such results cannot be generalized to other countries or cultures. So they're gonna, the people who want to believe that we have to strike sexism out of gaming because it's a societal problem are latching onto that as a reason to dismiss this study, and that's, I disagree with that. I think this study has limited validity. Because of what I said about Germany. Now, it would be great to see this study replicated in different parts of the world. I would love to see that. And then it also good for them, cautioned against concluding that, you know, the cultivation effects may be prevalent for children under 14, which, of course, children under 14 shouldn't be playing adult games. Like, the rare one can handle it. My nephew was 13, got bored, so we let him play Dragon Age. I mean, he loved it. But the other things I thought were very interesting in this study, and this jumped out because this is something I said and I went, whoa, okay, now I see why they brought this to my attention. They said, Given the broad range of gaming systems, genres, and games, and the differences in the user's personal preferences, it cannot be assumed that there is a typical media diet for video games. Accordingly, there is no universal video game reality that could uniformly affect perceptions of real-world social realities. That's critical when you're using television cultivation theory to apply to games, and I've talked about this previously. That is critical. The reason television was so powerful historically is that it was a central cultural factor in people's lives. It was central to especially American life. And that was important because it had a mass cultivative effect. You know, they said general and broad cultivation effects of video games are somewhat unlikely as players differ in the games they play, and the interactivity of the medium also causes the experience of the same game to differ between players. Yes, something else I have said. Yes, and this is critical when applying tools created for television to video games. Good for these people. That weird sound was me slapping my thigh because I'm very excited about this. Very, very excited that researchers are actually acknowledging these points. We have this on the record now, because that means that when we go on to study more, that we've got sort of a precedent set there, that we recognize video games are unique in that way, and we have to be very careful applying tools like television cultivation theory to predictive analysis of video games. Yes, excellent, right? Also, this was done over the telephone, so it wasn't somebody face-to-face. You know, people are more likely to tell interviewers what they want to hear face-to-face. But this is very interesting. This is a really good start because it's a well-designed study, despite what some people say. Is it perfect? Most studies aren't perfect, because researchers have to do the best with what they have, and there's no perfect conditions. But this is a really good start, and I'm happy to see this. Being proven right is nice, but even if I was proven wrong, I'd like to be able to read a well-done study that's, properly laid out, so we can actually rely on the results. And that was my issue with some of the others, is they were very short, and I didn't really feel like they were actually meaningfully testing the question. So this is, as they said, similar to what has been suggested for aggression. It is likely that there are factors such as personal experience and family and peer influences that affect the development, proliferation, prevention, or reduction of sexist attitudes more strongly than fictional media content. This is very important going forward because there is a precedent for that. That is an assumption, but it's an assumption based on other stuff and findings regarding, aggression in games. Because unlike this, they actually did find that previous studies found that playing violent games increases aggression. Not necessarily violence, but it does increase aggression. We did have a cultivative effect regarding aggression. Temporarily. Now, aggression and violence are not the same thing, and in some cases, aggression can be a good thing. So, social factors determine what you're going to do with that. Now, why is this relevant to games and the making of games? Well, it's relevant because, as I said before, if something is harmful, it should be taken out. If something is not harmful, there should not be demands that they are taken out. So this study, implies that, or means that having a male protagonist in a game isn't going to make a player think men are better natural leaders, or that men should make decisions for women. All right, we don't have to worry about that. So what are we really coming down to here with this more female playable characters issue? Well, we're coming down to a question of player preference, and that is still valid. In a way, that is still valid. If there are people who want to play as women in games and are not being effectively, if their demand is not being met by the supply, then gaming can make more money by, by catering to this untapped market. That's good business. And that's where I want to leave it. If you want to look up the latest thing about Temple Run and the little girl that said she wanted to play as a girl and she had to either pay for it, unlock it, and she didn't think that was right. And the makers of Temple Run agreed. So now, you can play as a girl without paying or without, earning credits for it, which takes a crazy long time. So, that sort of thing, catering to the market, is great, especially when it is young kids. I think that games for kids should be allowed to play as a boy or a girl just because I know that's a thing for kids. I mean, I was a weird kid in that way, that when we played Thundercats as a kid, I was always Liano because I identified more with the fact that he was a redhead than, Chitara was a girl. No, that didn't matter to me. Liano was the redhead, so I was Liano. I know. Make of that what you will. But I guess it just says that kids identify with things more than gender. But they still identify with like. They want to interact with media and toys and things like that are like them, that they see themselves in. But going forward, I think it still is relevant to, talk about inclusion of women as smart business. Absolutely. But I think we have to cool the rhetoric on, excuse me, my allergies are acting up today. Sneeze on the truth. I think we have to cool the rhetoric on, we have to change this because it's harmful. Increasingly, there's no proof, right? And hey, if we get proof in future, I will be the first one to change my mind. If we have multiple studies that come out and, say certain things increase rape myth, I will be right on there saying, no, get it out. If that's the case, get it out. We don't have that yet. And we may never have that. We have to wait for the science. We can't preemptively start a moral panic before we have the science. We have to wait for the science and then make our decisions, right? So I think for the time being, we need to cool the rhetoric on the idea that games make you sexist, and people are already walking back from that going, well, you never said that. But, it was reinforce and amplify sexism was the wording, reinforce and amplify. It doesn't so far. So what we are down to now is that, and I won't just say women want to play as women. What I will say, because I know a lot of guys who, if given a choice, they will play as a female character. So there is enough demand in the marketplace to warrant creating more female playable characters. That we can say with a relative degree of certainty. Fine. It is not the kiss of death people once believed to have a female lead in your game. The games will sell. Now, why have games with female leads not historically sold? That's a complicated question. And there are many factors, in part, that some of them got through because, they didn't care who the protagonist was, because it wasn't a big title for the company. Therefore, they didn't fight as hard about making a man it'll sell better. There's some of this behind the scenes stuff. So I think we'll get much farther collectively if we talk about serving the market and market demand and things like this, and less on moral panic. And I think that's very positive and very important, and I think it still matters to talk about what makes interesting male characters, what makes interesting female characters. I think this is all important because it's all art critique. And I part of the joy of games is sharing the experiences. So that I'm not saying that should go away. I'm just saying we need to take what we've learned and instead of fighting it, just incorporate that in. Now, some people are going to be having some trouble now because they're so trained to go based on the harm reduction principle. And they dug in so strongly that they're going to have trouble walking back from that. But I think it's possible. I think that we can make the point. Now, I mean, we're going to have trouble in realistic military shooters, right? That it's going to be harder to have a female protagonist in games based on modern militaries, because in most countries women don't see frontline combat. So we can't really expect it there, and those are quite popular, but other types of games are also incredibly popular. Maybe it's time for a playable female character in Grand Theft Auto who still associates with hookers, right? Like, maybe it's time for that. Maybe it's time for a female playable character in a numbered Halo game. Maybe, right? We're gonna do a passing of the baton fairly soon in the Uncharted franchise. Now, Uncharted's tricky because the only thing that makes Uncharted not Tomb Raider is, that it's a dude. So maybe that's a bad one. I'm gonna walk back from that. Maybe it's time for Sony to bring back Heavenly Sword, right? A game that was incredibly underrated. Critics were harsh on that game. Harsh. Because it was too short. And I keep thinking back to that game right now, because part of the reason they made those games short back there is they were struggling with some of the similar but not the same issues to the stuff they're struggling with the modern console cycle now. And instead of making games that glitched and lagged and had frame rate issues, they just made them shorter so there was less to crunch and they could fix it better. And as the PS3 generation went on, the games got longer and longer and longer, and that's how it works. But Heavenly Sword was a beautiful game on its own. It was just only 6 hours long. But that 6 hours was a pretty good 6 hours. And I liked the characters, and it was one of the first great motion capture acting games. Andy Serkis did the motion capture direction. It was this little gem that didn't get its due, and that was the one where I did hear critics privately go, we were too hard on that game. We were too hard on Heavenly Sword. But there are other games that don't have female protagonists that critics were hard on as well. Games like Alan Wake and things like that. Some critics were merciless on the gameplay of Alan Wake when it wasn't bad. It was different. We were so unused to survival horror when that game came out that the idea of a fairly weak, physically weak protagonist without a melee attack pissed some people off. But now I'm digressing. There is more to talk about in gender in games, just from an interest perspective. But I think that we need to shift the focus from harm and potential harm to a question of how can we include the largest possible number of gamers of all races, creeds, colors, sexual orientations, gender identities, etc., etc. How do we include the largest number of people? And that is not as simple as, say, just make, racially diverse or gender diverse casts, because then it comes down to how do you display that diversity? How do you work the diversity within the diversity and create interesting characters instead of just checks in a box on a diversity checklist? So that's why I think we are. Thank you guys for bringing this to my attention. This has been Feedback Friday. And have a good weekend. Have a calm weekend, which may mean staying off Twitter. And we'll be back on Monday with Mountain Monday.